like the most mysterious gemstone in the world makes sense to you, but then like, it's tangible, it makes sense, but then trying to use this darn computer. Jade, BC Jade, Nephrite, Jadeite, Omphacite. What do these words mean? How can you tell the difference? And is jade really that complicated? Or is there just a lot of confusing misinformation out there? Shane Zach of Freshwater Jade is going to help us out with these questions and more as we get up close and personal with actual jade specimens and examine their characteristics and sources. Thanks for joining us today, Shane.
Yeah, you're welcome. Happy to be here.
So if anybody doesn't know, Shane is a jade carver, and he's actually an expert in sourcing, selling rough and carved jade to the public as well as the industry, and is a phenomenal resource for carvers, jewelry professionals, and of course, lovers of jade. I actually picked up a few pieces from him when I was in Tucson, and he's going to tell us a little bit about these materials, starting with this slab of BC Jade.
So I've been working with jade for like 12 years now. I started just kind of fussing with stuff and doing it as a hobby, and it has since grown into both the jewelry business and then the rough side of things, the supply side. So doing specimens as well as slabs like you got from me. And so that particular slab is BC Jade. So the BC referring to British Columbia, coming from Canada, right? So British Columbia right now provides the majority of the world's like commercial nephrite. They've got big mining operations. They supply a lot to China, and then us carvers in the West here also get, bits and pieces of it that trickles down. Yeah, that particular slab, I don't know exactly where in BC it comes from because there's all kinds of mines. That one actually came from an old stock collection. So part of my sourcing is either, direct from the mine if I can, but occasionally I end up buying a big collection of jade that somebody would have been adding to, a long time ago, and they've since passed and the collection's being sold. So that's where that particular slab came from. So it just came with a Canadian jade label, and it looks pretty classically Canadian to me.
And it's got some of the kind of like black speckledy spots. What is there a word for that? I don't know as much about nephrite, but I do tend to see that in nephrite, especially. Is it mostly in Canadian material or just kind of all over the place?
It seems to be pretty ubiquitous. I have seen it in just about every source. It's pretty rare to actually find pieces of nephrite without that, and those tend to be graded out as like very high grade material. So when you're looking at nephrite, if you don't have any of those little black dots, I've heard them referred to as like iron or graphite. I still have yet to really. I think it kind of depends on the piece. Sometimes they're big, sometimes they're little.
Would you call them inclusions?
Yeah, I would consider that an inclusion, and it depends who you're talking to. I think they can add to a piece, especially if you have a really clear piece of nephrite. You'll get a lot of depth from those inclusions because you can see them going further into the piece.
And then the color is pretty characteristic of Canadian too, right? Just kind of, how would you describe it? Like an olivey, kind of a dark olivey,
kind of like a
forest green,
like spinach green color. Canadian nephrite tends to be what I think of as most people, what comes to their mind when they think of jade. It's your classic kind of like deep green. Some of it tends to be a more yellow green. Some tends to be like a darker forest green. And it just really depends on, when it formed, what kind of other minerals were present. And then the location as well, are going to have different characteristics.
So, and then this slab, because did you start with a bigger piece and then cut this into like a smaller, do you call it a slab?
Totally. Yeah. So that's the slab that would have been cut off. I had a few blocks of that material, and they were really large. A lot of them were anywhere from like 10 to 20 pounds. And so I was just slicing slabs off of that material for other people to work with.
And then once it's been kind of like cut into the slab, it's a duller look than nephrite is normally. And I don't have any of your carvings, but I have from Jade West, I have this bangle. And if you hold them next to each other, it's the same location, right, that it comes from. But this looks different because it's been, what's happened to it that makes this shinier than the
so
slab?
A couple different things. The shiny is going to come from the processing. So to take a slab like that and turn it into, usually I'd take a slab like that and turn it into earrings. So I would actually slice that in half again, grind it down, and you move through a series of both diamond and then silicon carbide grits, and then you polish it. There's a variety of ways people approach that, different polishing pastes and compounds. And so then you can achieve that really high finish that will make the color pop, as well as, give it that real like shininess.
Is there a wax on top of it, or is this just from the polishing?
I mean, I couldn't tell you, I guess, for that specific bangle, but if I was approaching it, there would be no wax involved. It would just be simply from the polish.
Jade seems to take, like nephrite jade especially, seems to take a really, really high polish. I don't know if it's the hardness of the material or the toughness of the material. Hardness meaning resistance to scratching, or toughness meaning resistance to breaking. But toughness refers more to its structure, whereas hardness has a little bit more to do with the surface. Which is it that really affects that,
so
luster?
The hardness typically is going to help take a really high polish if that's what you're going for. So, jade is kind of sitting in that perfect zone of both toughness and then as well as hardness. And nephrite is tricky because it is all across the board. I mean, I have nephrites that are fairly soft and nephrites that are a little bit harder. And so as a carver, I approach those very differently. For example, I've got a bracelet on and it'll be hard to see, but this is a nephrite jade from California, and it tends to be on the softer side. So I tend not to polish that really high. I don't take that to a high gloss. I'm going to leave that at more of a kind of a soft satin finish, and that will be a little bit more conducive to that kind of jade. Whereas that bangle you have, it looks to be like a fairly high quality and a fairly hard jade. And so it'll take a really high polish. So it really does kind of depend on the piece of nephrite you have. Every piece of jade you work is a little different.
That's so interesting about jade, because a lot of gemstones, it's really not that way.
Totally.
Jade, each piece it's being an aggregate. You can have different proportions of different elements and different materials within that rock.
Totally.
And so I guess that's probably why you would see deviation depending on the source.
Yeah, and it really, I mean, all across the world. I mean, nephrite is fairly common, right? And then the grades of nephrite within that can be either more rare or more common sort of thing. And it totally changes depending on the piece you're working with. And it can change within the same stone from the same area. I've had blocks where it can go from hard to soft almost within the same piece. So every time you're working with it, you're kind of like, well, I wonder what we're going to find here.
That's so fun, though. It's like a mystery. So this we called it BC Jade, referring to British Columbia, Canada. And I did want to just kind of point out to anybody watching that BC Jade, this is natural. Like, it came out of the ground this way. It's not been treated. It's not been dyed or anything like that. BC Jade should not be confused with, we say B+C Jade when we're referring to jadeite that has been acid bleached and then impregnated with polymer and dyed. And we call that B+C Jade. So it's very confusing because there's BC Jade, which is good and natural, and then B+C Jade, which is like bad and not natural. They sound similar, but they're totally different things. And that kind of brings up a really interesting point, that nephrite and jadeite, while both called jade, are actually different things. They're different mineral aggregates. Even though they have many similarities, being, both polycrystalline, both being aggregates, having similar colors in some cases, and also tremendous toughness for both of them, they are actually different. And I cover that in some of my other videos for those of you who are watching. Like, I have a video on real versus fake jade, and I talk about the jade buying guide that kind of looks at the differences. But in regards to like the materials that we have here in front of us, I think it's interesting to note this is also from Shane. This is Guatemalan jadeite, right? And then kind of holding it next to the Canadian nephrite. There are definitely noticeable differences, like in color, but you can also kind of see similarities. Like, you can kind of see how people would easily get confused, between nephrite and jadeite, and kind of like misunderstanding the distinction between what we call the two jades.